Welcome to the first Weight Watchers show of 2026. As you probably know, if you've listened to this show before, the Weight Watchers show is where you find out everything you need to know about late and slow payment to small businesses. My name is Terry Corby. I'm the founder and CEO of Good Business Pays. This show is a special one for a few different reasons. Number one, of course, it's the first show of 2026. Fantastic. But also, apart from that, we are days away from our fifth birthday at Good Business Pays. It was 5 years ago during COVID times that I founded Good Business Pays to bring an end, or hoped to bring an end, to late and slow payment problems for small businesses. And at that time, we could only dream of the kind of things that we're talking about today that would help bring in protections for small businesses against late payment. And here we are, 5 years later, on the verge of what I think, my opinion is, of having perhaps the best protections for small businesses around late payments of any country in the world that I can think of. And I know a lot of those countries and their legislation. And we're lucky to have with us today the minister responsible for introducing all of these changes, Minister Blair McDougall. Welcome to you, Minister.
Hi, Terry. I'm getting excited listening to you talking about what we're going to do. I think it is a huge step forward.
It's a very big day. It's a very big day, and I'm very excited. There's a lot of detail in what we're going to talk about over the next 40 minutes or so, but it is a big day. Tell us why you think it's a big day.
Well, I mean, for me personally as a minister, it's a big day because there are a limited number of times you'll get to do something like this where you're really fundamentally changing the terms of how the economy works and making it fairer and dealing with such a big injustice. I think it's also a really big day, and this is I mean tribute to you, Terry, and others who have been in the trenches on this issue for such a long time. This has been such an entrenched problem within our economy that has hurt so many people and undermined the entrepreneurial efforts of so many people. So the opportunity to do something about it in a decisive way is so exciting.
And of course, before you got into the world of politics, you were a business person yourself. I know we've talked about this before, with some experience of late and slow payment yourself, I believe.
Yeah, so I mean that's another reason why this is exciting for me personally, is that this will be a moment of catharsis for me as well. I ran my own business for going on 10 years. I delivered a lot of aid and strategic support, particularly for people living under dictatorships. I also wrote a lot of strategies for organisations in the UK and that sort of thing. And I remember in particular one Christmas where I was owed tens of thousands of pounds. And you're sitting there thinking, am I going to be able to afford the type of Christmas I want for my kids? That feeling of anxiety where you're hitting refresh on the bank account to see if the invoice has finally been paid. And that feeling of sort of anger and powerlessness as you know that the person sitting, this anonymous person sitting somewhere in a finance department not paying you, perhaps not out of badness, but just out of a sense of indifference, and the pain that causes. So yeah, I think that the moment we finally pass this legislation will be, as I say, a kind of cathartic moment for me.
Very good. Well,
Very
let's
good.
get on to some of the detail around this, because this announcement that you're making today comes at the end of quite a long period of consultation and a deep consultation as well with all sorts of folks. What's the sort of headline message of the who, what, why, where, when of what's being announced today?
So we are changing the payment terms. So we're going to a mandatory 60-day cap on payment terms. We're giving the Small Business Commissioner powers to investigate, to adjudicate, to fine those who behave badly. And we're requiring greater transparency and reporting on payment practices as well. But the thing I think that runs through all of it is changing that power relationship when it comes to late payments. At the moment, across all of these different elements, too often we rely on the small company who won't want to annoy their big customer, for whom this can become an existential threat. We're relying on them to challenge things, to take on so much of the burden. And the thing that runs through all of this is shifting that over to those bigger companies so that they behave responsibly.
And this is a big problem for the UK, isn't it, in terms of the size of the problem? It's not a small problem. These are big changes you're talking about here, but it is actually a sizable problem, right?
It is, and look, small businesses, and as I say, I know from running it myself, running a small business is always hard. At the best of times, it's been a challenging few years, but I don't think we should underestimate exactly how important this is. Our own analysis reckons that this is about an £11 billion cost to the British economy. We see so many businesses going out of business because of this. We think about 38 a day. And it is just a time suck for entrepreneurs, about 133 million hours being spent chasing invoices that could be spent chasing new customers, developing new products, serving existing customers. And so it's a productive drain on our economy. It's not just unfair, it's unproductive.
Yes, and just to add to those figures, our own analysis looking at the cost of late paid invoices in the last 6 months of 2025, we found that there were £5 billion worth of late paid invoices where there was 0% dispute on the invoice. So that's
Yes.
no dispute on the invoice, 5 billion from what amounted to be 2,000 companies out of the 10,000 that report. So I really think the figures are huge that that are related to this.
And think of how many, think of what that £5 billion in cash flow would buy in terms of new staff, new opportunities, research and development, all of those things that could be offering to the British economy. So, we'll talk a lot about the injustice and the unfairness of this, but this is about economic growth as well, and getting the economy back on its feet.
And just to reassure folk, I mean, a lot of the people that will listen to this podcast are working in very big companies, so they will be affected by this. But this has been quite a long period of consultation, and a lot of people have been involved in that, haven't they? Obviously, we have, but lots of big businesses, small business organisations, all sorts of folks have been involved in terms of checking this before you've come to these decisions today.
Yes, and overall business are, particularly those who've suffered from late payments, as you would expect, are enthusiastic about it. But many of the big companies that you've worked with for a long time, Terry, who do pay and do the right thing, are enthusiastic for it as well, because if you're a big company with good payment practices, in a sense, you are being undermined by those who hang on to money that should be paid to suppliers, and boosting their own cash flow unfairly. So there is enthusiasm for this, but there are elements, and we'll maybe touch on some of this, where we have adapted and tried to show that we are listening within this consultation. But we're trying to do that in a way that doesn't open the floodgates for all sorts of exemptions, because this has to be about that fundamental change to the rules of the game when it comes to fair payment.
Yes, we will get into that detail, because in the past, of course, a lot of companies have been able to, I would say, as the campaigner, game the system. And I know that there's been a lot of work in this to make sure that those opportunities to do that are ironed out as much as they possibly can be. Let's get into some of the detail then. The first area I wanted to ask you some questions about is the role of the Small Business Commissioner, a person that I work with, Emma, of course, in that role at the moment. I work with very closely. And so you're going to be strengthening the powers of the Small Business Commissioner role in a few ways. Would you like to tell us a little bit about those areas, please?
Yeah, so as you say, Emma does an extraordinary job at the moment, getting millions of pounds back for small businesses. But at the moment, a lot of the time she needs to be invited in to do this. And if you're a small company, you don't want to raise, again, as I said earlier on, a dispute with one of your biggest customers. That power relationship doesn't really work there. So in that context of the strength in payment terms that we're bringing in, it's about giving her the power to come in and investigate payment practices, to adjudicate on poor payment practices, because at the moment, small companies have to bring the legal case in order to resolve things. And what she'll be able to do is initiate that herself, and it changes the burden of that onto the larger company to challenge her adjudication. And then finally, the power to fine. So where she sees particularly egregious late payment behaviour, she will then be empowered to fine those worst performing companies, potentially tens of millions of pounds. So it creates that financial risk there. And like all powers of enforcement and investigation, it's not just about when she has to use those powers, it's the very presence of them we hope will help drive that better behaviour across the economy.
Right. Nobody wants to be, if you're in a big company, fined for not treating your suppliers fairly, right? You don't really want to be called out for that.
Exactly. And you've been doing that work for a long time, Terry, trying to give that sense that poor payment practice is something you would judge a company on in the same way that you would judge them for poor employment practices or environmental damage or all of the other things that have become rightly socially unacceptable in terms of corporate behaviour. As you say, no one will want to be on the rough end of these new powers that the Small Business Commissioner will have.
And do you know yet, in terms of the powers to investigate and adjudicate, how that would start off? Would a small business complain about somebody, or would the Small Business Commissioner be keeping an eye on companies that do that? What would that process look like, do you think?
So a small business could complain, and they certainly can do that at the moment. But it could also just be an anonymous tip-off or information the Small Business Commissioner has got through other sources. Because again, what we don't want is to have that power relationship where the small business is so worried about losing the custom of someone who pays poorly that they are nervous and too worried to bring forward the information themselves. So the information can come from a lot of different sources.
And the power to fine, have you thought yet, or has it been decided on what basis the amount of money a company would be fined would be? Is it a percentage of revenue? Is it something different? How would you arrive at a figure?
So those are questions we're looking at just now. But I think it's fair to say we're circling around those types of things about percentages of revenue and that sort of thing, because it has to be a significant and substantial financial penalty in order to drive the change that we're looking at. So as I say, it could be up to tens of millions of pounds that a company's being fined.
So it's not a £50 driving fine. It's something more significant than that.
No, exactly, because if you as a very large poor paying company are gaining tens of millions, hundreds of millions of pounds in cash flow out of this, then you have to have a disincentive to doing that feels substantial.
So good. We're going to go on to the second area, which is around the reforms of the late payment law. And in particular,
Mm.
one area I wanted to ask you about was the board level scrutiny of payment practices. Many people will already know that as of the beginning of this year, companies already have to now report their payment practices in their annual reports. But part of this consultation was how involved should the board of directors or the audit committees, those folks that sit on
Mm.
boards, be involved in scrutinizing that? Where did you land on that?
So we're going to require boards or audit committees to have to publish an explanation of poor payment performance. And this again is partly about creating that environment where no one wants to be on the naughty step when it comes to poor payment. But it's also about ensuring that at the board level, in the way that they will discuss other matters which are of deep importance to the company, that the payment practices are part of those bigger strategic discussions within the companies, making sure that poor payment practice is something that is discussed around the board level table or around the audit committee.
Well, and because it's going to be published in their annual report, they'll especially want to make sure those figures are right and well explained, I suspect.
Exactly, because your annual report is where you try to put your best face on for the world. So no one wants to have to explain why they are leaving, particularly SMEs hanging within their supply chains. And also, that sort of thing will also inform for small businesses whether they particularly want to work with those larger companies too.
So, not all companies have an audit committee. So, would it be someone who is named on the board as a position that is looking at that, or just the general expectation that the board will be looking at it?
So the idea is that either boards or audit committees will have to do it. We had a discussion around this, and we wanted to ensure that it was a sort of broader conversation, because not all companies have audit committees, for example. So having that at the board or audit level means that we're ensuring that there is a broader conversation going on across the economy.
And of course, many companies, especially the big ones, it's the job of everyone on the board to make sure payment practices are delivered in the right way in their part of the organization, right? It's not just finance that is responsible, it's the whole
Exactly.
organization.
Yes, and again, it's part of what I talked about earlier on about trying to change that whole culture and the whole rules of the game across the economy.
Now, one of the other, perhaps one of the most controversial aspects of the consultation was around maximum payment terms. So, where did you land on maximum payment terms?
So we've said this will introduce a 60-day maximum payment term. As you know, at the moment, the law talks about a 60-day maximum term, but actually in practice, bigger companies will negotiate exemptions to that that often are to the disadvantage of smaller companies. So now there will be that 60-day cap as standard, without having all of those sort of widespread exemptions. There will be some exemptions to it, but in a very, very targeted, very, very limited way, so that essentially smaller companies are not bullied into payment terms that leave them hanging for long periods of time before they're paid for goods or services.
Now, so while we're so a lot of people's ears will prick up when they hear about so maximum 60-day payment terms, let's just talk about a couple of the exemptions because that
Mm.
will be one of the questions is what will the exemptions be?
Yes.
So I think you've thought about, for instance, categorizing companies into large to large and large to small, etc. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the two examples of those limited exemptions are you mentioned large to large. So The purpose of this legislation is about changing that power relationship to become fairer. Where you have, I don't know, Unilever and Asda or Tesco negotiating longer payment terms for particular goods, no one would feel that that was an imbalanced power relationship. So a lot of big companies said to us, look, we absolutely accept the need for larger companies to pay their supply chains quickly and fairly. But where you're talking about two very larger companies negotiating terms, that would be different. And I think that's fair because this is a very big intervention in the economy, and generally speaking, where possible, government shouldn't be entering into contractual negotiations between private parties. So that's one of the very limited exemptions. The other, which many people raised with us, was the position of independent booksellers, who will have extended payment terms with publishers. In effect, you get lots of books, they sit on the shelf for a very long time. You don't have to pay for them for a long time because they are sitting unsold, large amounts of stock sitting on the shelf. Now, in that situation, that's clearly to the benefit of the smaller company rather than the type of problem that you and I are discussing, of those sort of David and Goliath injustices. So where the smaller company is the purchaser and it's clearly in their interest to do so, they would be allowed to negotiate longer payment terms with the larger company. But as I say, my approach as minister on this has been to make sure that we're not sort of opening the floodgates for lots of different exemptions here, because we know from the existing exemptions that are there to the 60-day terms, those are exploited to the extent that the current 60-day terms in law become meaningless.
Yes, that goes back almost 30 years, I suspect, to the time when the wording in the legislation was 60 days unless there was some good reason for it, and everybody found a good reason to extend those payment terms. This seems to me to be, just from a personal perspective, quite a common sense and pragmatic way of approaching this. Large to large, they've got to be able to have those kind of sensible payment terms that allow them to do business. And small to large, like you say, booksellers that have to keep books on the shelves for ages that they might buy from a large publisher. I think the same might be true in musical instrument shops and luxury jewelry shops, where you hold a lot of stock you have to buy into a small business, and it might be a while before it sells, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And then the examples you give, and the example of the bookseller, the key thing is it in the interests of the smaller party, so that there isn't that sort of exploitation going on.
Okay, that's very clear. Next one area was introducing deadlines for people who want to dispute an invoice, to sort of say you've got a certain amount of time before you can, time runs out before you can say an invoice is disputed. Tell us about that one.
Yeah, exactly. So we know that often it will get to the end of the payment terms agreed in the contract, and suddenly people will get a message from the customer's finance department with a frivolous dispute for some aspect of the invoice, and sometimes it can be several disputes, as poor payers string out that process of paying for as long as possible. And so the legislation will bring in a time limit for those disputes. This is where we get into quite technical aspects that we'll work through in the legislation. But it's really important that there is that time limit so that people cannot continue to string small companies along indefinitely.
And then another area perhaps that's a tricky one, but it seems like you've landed in a particular place on this, is interest on late payments, which will be mandatory. This is an interesting one.
It is. So we're seeing that there'll be mandatory interest on those late payments of 8% above base. Now, For the small company, for example, being paid that 8% above base, so say 12, 13%, whatever it would be. That's not a huge amount of money for the individual company and that individual transaction. But if you think about that big company who is a poor payer and thousands of invoices and potentially hundreds of millions of pounds of invoices that are sitting there, that creates a real financial jeopardy for those big companies. It's saying that if you don't pay and you don't pay fairly and quickly, it's going to cost you. So that's a really significant thing. And I think the change from where we are at the moment, as you know, Terry, is we do have legislation on interest on late payments at the moment, but it's again, it's sort of up to the smaller company to chase it, to ask for it. It's often negotiated out in the contracts because there are all sorts of loopholes for it. So again, this completely changes that power balance so that those small companies aren't expected to spend their time pursuing the customers that are so important for their business.
So just so I can fully understand that, if I'm the small business and my invoice is now late, I don't have to ask for that interest to be paid. That interest would be paid
Yes.
because it's arriving late. And it's the responsibility of the big company, let's call it the big company at the moment, to adjust the payment so that if it was going to be £100, it's now going to be £112.50 or whatever the figure happens to be.
Yes, they'll be legally required now to do that. And again, we spoke at the beginning, you think of the amount of time that small businesses spend chasing on these things. More and more, all the way through this package, it's about putting that responsibility onto the big companies rather than the small companies,
right?
To deal with this unfairness.
Okay. May I also ask if that rule will apply? This may be a little bit out of your brief or your area, but I want to make sure we're joined up. Would that also apply to public sector purchasing as well?
Do you know? I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, I'll have to check into that. But we certainly in the public sector we do have that responsibility as well. And as you know, we've been alongside the work we're doing on late payments across the economy. We've also been reminding public sector bodies of their responsibility to pay on time. As well. I'm very proud my own department has a very good payment practices with 95% of invoices being paid within 5 days, 99% within 30 days. But we have to hold ourselves in the public sector to as high a standard as we are expecting the wider economy to be held to.
Yes, and the Procurement Act does a good job at that, and it's well aligned with everything that we've been talking about here. I just am sure that the businesses will say, if you're asking us to do something, are you doing it yourself? That kind of question. Yeah. Very good. Well, I guess my next question really is, what do you now expect businesses to do? Because this is a very big set of things you're talking about. When should they get ready? When should they expect to see something else, the next step or the progression of this through to legislation? What's the timing on that?
I think you can read from the fact that we are enthusiastically announcing this, that this is something that we are looking to move forward with as quickly as possible. My message to businesses here, particularly those large businesses whose payment practices may not be everything we want them to be at the moment, is get ready for this. This is coming. The rules of the game are changing. And don't wait for the law to change to start doing the right thing. Start moving your payment practices towards those 60-day terms. Start phasing out and setting a limit for those disputes with invoices, because this is coming anyway. So you may as well get ahead of it, and you may as well improve your practices now. And we know, Terry, this is a journey, and you showing me that fantastic document with all the graphs in it, with all the improvements in payment practice from companies across the economy. People are moving in this direction anyway. They can see what the direction of travel is. My hope is the knowledge that this is coming accelerates that process before we even get to the legislation.
I'm sure that will happen. I'm absolutely sure that will happen. And for those who are listening, on Minister McDougall's probably first few days, I attended a webinar when he introduced himself and asked the question, are you really committed to this? And he said, absolutely. And here we are today, taking a big next step. So, Minister McDougall, thank you very much for spending this time with us today. And we look forward to seeing the next steps on this.
Well, this is us keeping a promise that was made in the small business strategy, and there's a whole lot more in there that we need to deliver on as well. But it's going to be a genuine personal pleasure to take these payments through. And again, Terry, thank you for all the work you've done on this over the last few years, because you have moved the needle as an individual in a way that normally only government action can do. So it's extraordinary.